from CFP, episode 77. My name is Matthew Coyle. I'm the Director of Financial Planning for Advanced Capital Group, otherwise known as ACG, here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I'm in my office today, as I often am on a Thursday or a Friday. Today we're talking about rates. Why are they not coming down? Inflation's cooling. Economy seems to be in pretty good shape. People are generally pretty well off. Why are rates not coming down in a post-COVID world where inflation is cooling? I get this question a lot, and what to do with your investments in the meantime and your debts in the meantime. Some strategies to think about, how you handle your money in this particular time. Let's dive in. Okay, well today we are talking about the most important piece of a market-based economy that you can focus on. Is it the stock market? No, that tends to get the most attention and tends to kind of suck the oxygen out of the room as far as media coverage. But it's actually not the bond market, it's not the stock market, it's not the currency market, it's interest rates. Interest rates are the most important thing in a market-based economy by far, simply because they determine what everything costs. Your mortgage cost, your credit cards, your consumer loans, your personal lines of credit, how much money companies spend on property, plant, and equipment, what their projects are, how many employees they want to have on their books. Everything is determined by the cost of money, which is determined by interest rates. So let's talk about that. And you can't talk about that without talking about inflation. All right, so talk about inflation. Let's look at a very simple inflation chart. I'll put it up on the screen right now. If you were looking at inflation a couple of years ago, you had a little bit of sticker shock going on. We were running at about somewhere between 9 and 9.1% year-over-year inflation a couple of years ago. And there was a number of reasons for this: government stimulus, post-COVID shutdown, supply problems, all sorts of issues, people bidding up the prices on pretty much everything because they just had to have it and they couldn't get it. So inflation was rampant about a couple of years ago. Fast forward a couple of years, as of this week's CPI report, we are now trending somewhere in the neighborhood of 3.25% to 3.5%, depending on who you believe and how you measure it. But we are down quite a bit from where we were, let's say, 2 years ago. Now, given that, why are interest rates on things like money market funds, mortgages, consumer credit, credit cards, revolving debt, whatever, why are they so high still relative to where they have been the past 10 years? So let's talk about that. We'll talk about what you can do about it, and we'll look at that right now. All right, so why are rates not coming down despite the fact that inflation is indeed cooling? We've seen the data. We know inflation is coming down. Some sectors are pretty stubbornly high, like auto insurance. Some components of food costs are still relatively high as far as inflation goes, but for the most part, inflation is cooling quite a bit and has cooled over the last couple of years quite a bit as supply chains fix themselves and so on and so forth. So why is this happening? What to do about it? Let's look for the first piece here at mortgages. That tends to be one that everybody seems to experience when buying a home. They look at mortgage rates quite a bit. Mortgage rates right now are about 7.5 to 7.8, maybe 7.9%, depending on your credit across the economy as I do this video, which is May 16th of 2024. As of May 16, 2024, we are currently at roughly 7.8% average 30-year fixed loan around the country. Not that much different, if you'll permit me just a little bit of nostalgia, not that much different from when this guy entered the business back in May of 1999, exactly 25 years ago, almost to the day actually. 25 years of being in this industry. When I first entered this business, believe it or not, the average mortgage rate at that time was about 7.2%. So we are not really outside of historical range when it comes to mortgage rates and buying a home in this country. Now, that might not feel good to you if you can't afford a home, but if you are waiting for the return of the 3 or 3.5% mortgage, or when we're going to get back to normal when it comes to mortgage rates, you may not want to wait too much longer. If rates do come down, prices are likely to rise. So if you can afford a home, maybe a slightly smaller home than you were planning, or maybe just something a little different than maybe you had planned based on cost, you may want to consider doing that within the next, let's say 6 months to a year or so, if and only if you can afford it. Don't force it, but if you can afford it, you may want to consider moving on something, because we are not really outside of historical norms that much when it comes to mortgages. So first thing to consider, that mortgages really aren't that expensive relative to where they were even 25 years ago when I entered this business. And if you can afford a home, again, don't push it if you can't, but if you can afford a home and it's within your reach, you may want to try and make that commitment sooner rather than later if it makes sense to you. All right, another point to consider. 10-year bonds, one of the most important investment vehicles not just in the country, but in the world, is a 10-year U.S. government bond, because so many other things cue off that rate. credit card rates, mortgage rates, consumer lending rates, many of them cue off the 10-year bond in the US. That's actually what I have this chart here in front of me is the 10-year bond. That 10-year bond, an average yield on a 10-year bond since 1962 is 5.8%, believe it or not. Where are we at today? We are roughly at 4.4, 4.5% as I look at this screen right now. So as of May 16, 2024, we are currently about, let's call it 4.5% roughly on a 10-year bond. Not out of historical average when you consider the average from 1962 until now is about 5.8%. I'm positive. I downloaded the data. I looked at it. 5.8%. So we are not historically that far out. In fact, we're slightly below the average rate on a 10-year bond, which determines cost across the economy. So when you're looking at investments to make and when you're looking at considerations on how to borrow, remember the fact that we're really not that far off the average. In fact, we are slightly below, believe it or not, the historical average on the most important debt security that controls or cues off, let's say, that other folks use to cue off when they price their products in the form of lending products. So get out there if you can afford to borrow some money and you're looking for it to make a project. Rest assured that you are not borrowing money outside of really what you consider to be historical averages. All right, next up, your liabilities. Do you have credit card debt that you could pay off? Do you have money sitting in the bank that you're kind of unwilling right now to use to pay off debts because you want to have that safety of the cash? If you are waiting for rates to come down on things like home equity lines of credit that you may have that are variable or credit cards that you may have that are variable, you may want to pay those off instead of incurring the extra interest charges because I don't think that these rates are going to move too much lower in the intermediate term. You might as well pay them off and avoid the interest costs. So when you're managing your own balance sheets, make sure that you pay off the easy stuff first, get that credit card debt off the books if you can do it. If you have other things, variable rate debt, things like home equity lines or personal loans, personal lines of credit, make sure, and if you can, get those paid off, get those off the books. Don't pay off your mortgage, but pay off the other stuff first. Credit cards, lines of credit, small loans, things, especially things that are variable, because it's honestly, those rates are probably not going to come down that much if we are in a higher for longer world. If that's the case, get those paid off. You'll thank yourself later for all the interest that you are going to save. All right, next up, your portfolio. If you are an investor whose portfolio is dominated by large cap holdings and you'd own nothing else other than maybe a few small, large cap mutual funds and basically own the same things, you may want to diversify some of your new money going into small and medium-sized companies. Now, this is only if you have, let's say, another 10 years of investing to go or more, and you've got time for these prices to come back. But I'll put this chart on the screen here behind me. It's simply a performance showing large cap and small cap relative performance since the early 2000s. Now, when I first entered my career, small caps were actually beating large caps as far as performance goes. It was not uncommon to see an advisor or a money manager with a very heavy allocation to small and medium-sized companies. This gradually changed, of course, as interest rates fell further and further. But I rarely see a portfolio now that's not dominated by large caps, including many of the portfolios that I manage, because that's where the returns have been. If you are a new investor or a relatively new investor and you've got new money coming in the market, maybe you're under the age of 45 and you're looking to put money to work, you may want to consider investing in small and medium-sized company shares as those prices recover and as interest rates gradually come back down, or even if they just level off. Large cap stocks historically are not cheap relative to where they've been. They may not be expensive, but they're certainly not cheap. Small and medium-sized company shares really are. They are very inexpensive relative to where they have been. I'm not going to point out specifically for the purposes of this video which ones, but if you want to reach out to me, you can certainly ask questions. If you are looking for places to put money and you haven't done anything outside of large caps for a while, you may want to consider diversifying yourself and just adding a few extra funds there for the long-term performance. Again, these things are cyclical. They tend to change, and interest rates to a large extent drive that, even if we stay higher for longer. So consider adding some diversification to your portfolio. It will help you in the long run, and your future self will thank you. All right, let's wrap this up. So if we are in a higher for longer world when it comes to interest rates, and we probably are, if you were looking for 3, 4, 5, 6 rate cuts from the Federal Reserve this year, and you're only going to get maybe 2 at the most, there's some things you can adjust, ways you can adjust and things you can do. Diversify your portfolios, pay down debt a little more aggressively, and just be aware, take advantage of those opportunities when you can as far as a home purchase if you find something that makes sense for you. If you have questions on anything I've said, or maybe you just want to argue, who knows, you can reach me at the email below. Thanks again for your time. Appreciate you watching. I will see you next time. Thanks.